Maxie Dunham tells of a colleague whose college son was trying to apply pressure for some more money from his dad. And in an email home, he wrote, "I can't understand why you call yourself a loving father when you haven't sent me a check in 3 weeks. What kind of love do you call that?" And his father emailed back, "That's unremitting love." We smile and we chuckle, but who has ever defined love that way, as unremitting? And we usually think of it as in completely opposite terms, total giving. And that's the way Jesus revealed a God who gives and gives until there's nothing left to give, and gives himself away. And that's the reason why this word of Jesus in our gospel lesson is such a shocking one. When you have done all that is commanded you, you say, "We are ordinary servants. We have only done our duty." In some translations, it says, "We are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty." This is one of Jesus' least familiar sayings, and one of his most confusing and one of his toughest. Though confusing and tough, saying doesn't let us off the hook. This is one of the reasons that I like lectionary preaching, is that it doesn't let me off the hook either. It pushes me to explore the more difficult sayings of Christ. This passage is not easy or simple to deal with, and yet it offers much needed lessons to us. I have to admit that I feel for the disciples. In recent passages, Jesus has been asking some fairly extraordinary things of them: to give away their possessions, to forgive those who wrong you, countless times to take up his cross and to follow him. No wonder they ask for more faith. They feel inadequate to the task around them, insufficient to the challenges, unable to imagine accomplishing any of what he is asking. I suspect that lots of us feel the same way. Like we need more faith just to get through, let alone to make a difference. And then something interesting happens. Because when the disciples recognize their need and ask Jesus for help, for more faith, you'd think Jesus would both welcome and grant their request. But he doesn't. Instead, he seems to rebuke them. "If you had even a speck of faith," he begins, implying that they don't have that kind of faith the size of a mustard seed. What kind of a way is that to respond to the disciples' earnest and heartfelt question? But what if the question the disciples ask isn't only earnest and heartfelt, but also problematic, even a little wrong-headed? Maybe then Jesus' sharp retort was just what they needed, and maybe just what we need. Obviously, we can't escape this parable that Jesus tells us, and his harsh words of teaching are, first of all, words about duty. We have difficulty with the story because of the harshness of the slave or servant in Jesus' day, and our neck stiffens in anger at the churlish, calloused master who never says thank you. He must have been an unfeeling, inconsiderate man, no compassion at all. His servant has been plowing in the field all day, literally slaving. He came in at sundown, his back aching, his whole body numb with weariness. And there's no acknowledgement of what he's done. Another duty laid upon him. He must now prepare his master's supper and wait until his master has eaten before he can sit and rest his weary muscles and renew his strength by whatever food is left. A harsh picture of the severity of duty. And it's that backdrop against which Jesus speaks to us. "So when you also have done all that is commanded, say, we are only ordinary servants. We have only done what was our duty. We have only done what we ought to do." No wonder we get our backs up at such a word. But let's get beyond our seething distaste for the inconsiderate master and speak a good word for duty. I believe that's what Jesus was doing. Duty is often not regarded as a pleasant word. It's not pleasant because we've come to the place in our society when all too common motto is, what is the least I can do to get by? The bar has been lowered in today's secular world. The blunt truth is that we are creators of a society where patterns of behavior, moral standards, and spiritual ideals have been undermined by negligence, cheating, and corruption on the grounds that everybody is doing it and any kind of worthwhile aim justifies the means. Jesus is telling us in this seemingly harsh word that there is an oughtness to life. That's more what duty is like, Jesus seems to say, simply the willingness to do what needs to be done. Moreover, duty isn't always heroic. Indeed, it usually isn't, but instead it is simply and humbly doing what needs to be done, big or small, great or mundane, just because it needs doing. There are demands that are placed upon us which allow no letting up in discipline. There is a sense in which we can never say, oh, thank God, I'm finished with that. I can rest now. I deserve a break. So duty is not a four-letter word. It's a word whose meaning needs desperately to be recovered in our day. A healthy sense of duty can save us from two debilitating sins, the sins of self-pity and the sins of self-righteousness. If we don't have a good perspective on duty, it's easy to fall into self-pity or self-righteousness. Isn't it easy to fall into a slough of self-pity because of all of the demands made upon each of us by our children, our spouse, our parents, our extended family, our home, our jobs, our roles, and our relationships? All of us fall victim to self-pity. What's the use, we may say? Politics are a mess. The election campaign is full of venom. The rich get richer. The poor get poorer. What difference does it all make? We would be saved a lot of emotional and physical energy if we could keep a perspective on the fact that we do indeed have duties. As citizens, we have duties. As members of the church, we have duties. We have duties and responsibilities as family members, as students. Our duties are shaped by the precious gift of the sacred relationships and commitments that we have made. Performing those duties doesn't mean that we are going to receive any special kind of consideration. Therefore, what right do we have to say, I've done everything right, why should this happen to me? I've done my duty, what have I done to deserve this? We're really getting to the point of extreme self-pity when we begin to think and say, seems the more good you do, the worse off you are. And closely akin to self-pity is self-righteousness. A right perspective on duty might save us from self-righteousness also. Aren't we all guilty? We do what is expected of us and even more. We begin to feel good. We teach Sunday school. We serve on committees. We work on partnership mission projects. We work in the kitchen and we work on buildings and grounds. And we feel good about what we're doing. And well, we should. And then we begin to feel righteous. What right does anyone have to ask me to do anything else? To add to the commitments I've already made? And then boom, we are confronted by Jesus' words. When you have done all that is commanded you, you say, we are ordinary servants. We have only done what was our duty, done what we ought. Maybe this is the reason we don't like the hard sayings of Jesus. It reveals our self-righteousness and condemns our smug attitude of ever thinking we measure up to the kingdom's demands. Is there any way, any of us, by any amount of effort or obedience to the will of God, can establish a claim of reward? Alexander Maclaren reminds us that for a person to call oneself unworthy is a blessed thing. For the master to call us one is an awful thing. Can you hear the difference? For God to call us an unprofitable servant is an act of judgment on God's part. And God does not do that in this passage. But to call ourselves unprofitable servants is to judge ourselves as well we might. It's to acknowledge, as Paul said, that none is righteous, no, not one, for we have all sinned and fallen short. So a healthy sense of duty saves us from the sin of self-pity and the sin of self-righteousness. That leads us to the final thought this word of Jesus calls us to pursue. Even on the surface, everything seems harsh and severe and demanding, and yet this word is surprisingly grace-filled. Here is a mighty call to faith in the grace of God. The disciples have made the request, Lord, increase our faith. It is then that Jesus tells the story of the grain of mustard seed, showing how important it is to have faith and that mighty things result from faith. Jesus responds, reminding them that only a little faith, only a little tiny faith, can transform the world. Luke then suggests that faithfulness and loyalty to Christ's way are not optional, but mandated for believers. Increasing faith emerges in the everyday events of life, in the spirit of the Buddhist saying, we chop wood and carry water. We do what is required of us in the daily responsibilities of life. Faith is a matter of life. It is a how, not a what. Belief finds its fulfillment in our responses to ordinary events. The world is made flesh at the workplace, driving a child to school, dealing with conflict, facing the challenges of difficult relationships or challenging family situations. And then Jesus adds the story of this harsh master and the unworthy servant, and he's telling both of these stories in response to the disciples' request to increase their faith. The message smacks of hyperbole or exaggeration, both in its description of the tree-moving faith and its chiding the disciples as worthless slaves for simply doing the duty. The latter is not intended to encourage work righteousness or the attempt to earn God's love by our own propriety or perfectionism. Rather, it's a reminder that faith is a lifestyle as well as a belief system. There are certain things that Christians simply do because they are Christians. We need to expect great things of ourselves and great things of God. We are not to settle for such half-hearted sentiments as Christians aren't perfect, they're simply forgiven, but aim higher in our ethic and spirituality. We are to aspire after lives of holiness and wholeness, living with our imperfections and knowing that God loves us, but constantly asking more of ourselves as followers of Jesus Christ in our family life and in the social world. We must raise the bar. And yet we are driven by this word to know that nothing we can do can satisfy the righteous demands of God. Paul put it so sharply that none of us is righteous. Isaiah tells us vividly that our righteous deeds are like a polluted garment. And note the precise words of Jesus. When you have done all that is commanded, you say, we are only ordinary servants. We have only done our duty. It is one thing for us to judge ourselves. It is quite another thing for Jesus to judge us. And so here's the exhilarating core of the gospel. The disciples ask, Lord, increase our faith. And he tells a soul-shaking call to see ourselves as unprofitable servants. And he was pressing his disciples, he's pressing us to make operable in our lives the great truth that there is nothing that can make a claim upon God. Deserving nothing, we must cast ourselves entirely into his merciful hands and find ourselves upheld by his great unmerited love, by his wondrous grace. We need to remove the bitter, toxic root of self-trust and replace it with the sweet, healing power of absolute reliance on him. Jesus burst the balloon of our self-confidence that we use to keep our heads above water. It's only when the balloon is popped And that we, like Peter, begin to feel ourselves sink and fling out our hands to Jesus and clutch his outstretched hands and pray, Lord, save me. Jesus responds to the disciples' request to increase their faith by saying to them that duty is perennial, and our own righteousness, no matter how noble and admirable it may be, establishes no claim whatsoever by God. And here it is, the core of the gospel. It is not our merit that releases God's grace. It is not even our need, because we all stand in the same need. It is our awareness of our need, the acknowledgement that we are simply servants, deserving nothing, and we place ourselves wholly into the merciful hands of God, and we find ourselves saved and upheld by God's great unmerited love. That's God's wondrous grace. That's good news, my friends. Thanks be to God. Amen.